emergency.
Today on Rescue 911, terror on the tracks. Two teens driving in heavy fog are struck by a train.
If it wasn't for the screaming, I would have swore I was looking at a dead person.
Now rescuers must battle the elements to save them.
Bud, the chopper can't fly. Not even airline?
911.
Whenever tragedy strikes, any of us might be forced to face the fact that our world will never be the same again. I'm William Shatner. Tonight, true stories of courage, strength, and love on Rescue 911. We begin on the evening of November 11th, 1991 in Seymour, Iowa, as Stephanie Chico invited her 15-year-old nephew and close friend, Dustin Kirkland, to go for a drive.
It was maybe 31 degrees. The streets had like a thin layer of ice. There really wasn't a lot of snow, but it was so foggy. I mean, you actually couldn't see the length of your driveway. It was so foggy.
Dustin had his learner's permit and was determined to get some driving practice.
Come on, Steph, let me drive.
Okay, just do the church. He's always been a good kid. He's been a good teenager. He's into sports. And that was his whole life, and I thought, why? Why did this happen to my son?
You couldn't ask for a better answer.
No kidding.
Come on now. For my nephew.
Oh, wow. My brother and sister.
Yeah.
When we continue.
Working in Seymour as a first responder sometimes is good and sometimes is not so good because you run into a lot of people you know, their friends, their family.
When a freight train traveling 35 miles an hour slammed into a car carrying 19-year-old Stephanie Chico and her nephew Dustin Kirkland, a woman who saw the crash ran to the nearest house to get help.
Stephanie's boyfriend, David McCann, happened to live there.
My father heard a knock on the door, and there was a lady there and said there'd been an accident. There was a car under the train.
A call for help went out as David and his father headed to the scene.
My father and I both realized it was Stephanie's voice. She was pure white and covered with blood. If it wasn't for the screaming, I would have swore I was looking at a dead person.
One of the first rescuers to arrive was Deputy Sheriff Vernon Brown.
I just took a few steps, towards the rear of the car, and I seen another body then laying in the ditch. You could hear him kind of gurgling. And I said something about, does anybody know who it is? And Larry McCann said, yeah, it's Dustin Kirkland.
Working in Seymour as a first responder sometimes is good and sometimes is not so good because you run into a lot of people you know, their friends, their family.
Seymour Fire Department volunteers EMT Teresa DeVore and her husband paramedic Doug DeVore were the first medical people on the scene.
First time I seen Stephanie, I thought that her spine had been broke and twisted 180 degrees. Then I realized that it was her legs. Actually, her toes were sticking into the ground.
Ricky, get down here.
Vernie was hollering because he had found Dustin. His head was bleeding really bad.
Tell Doug we got a fractured skull.
Vernon's brother came up to the scene, so we at that time had him apply direct pressure with gauze on his forehead. And when he did that, we found another huge laceration around the back of his head.
He brought one hand back and he says, "Oh my God, did you see skull?" Yeah, I did. I said, "But you know, we got to go on." Dustin was going to be our star pitcher that year for the baseball team. And I did think about that, you know. Didn't think he had a chance in the world.
Doug, the chopper can't fly. Not even airline?
And that just sunk in my throat because I didn't think she would make it to the hospital in time.
Why?
It's too foggy.
Dustin's father, Randy Kirkland, rushed to the scene as soon as he heard about the accident.
All I could think about is if he gets up, he ain't dead. So I was hollering at him, you know, "Get up, Dustin, you're not hurt." But it looked like to me that his head was being held together with a bunch of bandages.
He's got a big old wide open face in there.
He didn't have a good airway at all. We really felt like they needed the helicopters. But when they couldn't do that, it was up to us.
You the driver, Darren?
Both victims were transported to Wayne County Hospital. Kim Kirkland was notified that her son had been critically injured in an accident.
All I could think of was if he's going to die, that I wanted to be with him, not strangers. I said, "I'm a nurse, I'm not gonna freak out, I promise, I wanna go see him." And it was a mess.
Stephanie kept asking, "How's Dustin doing?" And I had to pull the curtain shut because I didn't want her to see what was going on. I was really worried that they'd probably have to amputate her legs. Her legs were like jello.
Doctors decided that Stephanie and Dustin needed to be transferred to the nearest trauma center 80 miles away.
They weren't gonna let me go. I thought, well, he has to be afraid. And I was just like, "Franny, I have to go, I have to go." And Bernie said, "Get in, we're going."
At that point, I just became a complete wreck. They didn't know if either one of them would ever make it on up to Des Moines.
Dustin's grandmother, Norma Chico, rode in the ambulance with her daughter, Stephanie.
I kept watching to see that she was alive, and I watched for the other ambulance out my side mirror, and I didn't see it coming. I knew that if Dustin died, it'd pull off.
Are you warm enough? I was riding in the back with Steph. Her blood pressure was falling, and we pretty had much everything done in the rig that we could do for her. It was just a race for time. She needed the trauma center.
Yeah, Shannon just had a birthday.
She asked me about one of my kids. She was laying there in extreme pain and critically injured, and she wanted to know about my daughter. And that's part of the closeness everybody has in this town.
At Iowa Methodist Medical Center, Dustin was examined by trauma surgeon David Sidney.
We took him in intubate several times.
Took him up to the monitor.
They had tried to put a tube in his throat to breathe for him, but were unsuccessful. Especially in somebody like Dustin who had a head injury. His head injury will only be made worse if he can't get enough oxygen to his brain.
There just seemed like there was a lot of things that people weren't saying to me. So I guess I was getting a hint that he ain't gonna be all right. He ain't gonna make it.
We'll be going to CT first, though, before the OR.
They prepare you for the worst. I remember they told me, "You'll never have your son again. He'll never be the same." And I didn't care. I just wanted him to live.
OR 5, right around the room.
Stephanie underwent surgery to treat her shattered legs and elbow and a collapsed lung.
Make sure you call the chaplain before.
Dustin was operated on to repair his fractured leg, but remained in a coma.
Okay. Surgeon will be out to talk to you soon. Okay.
We look for family support in helping the recovery of injured patients. And a mother's voice has to be the most anxiety-reducing thing.
You can do it. Just try.
I sat there day and night talk to him quiet.
Alice is gonna come see you tomorrow.
The kids had made a tape so I could play that tape over and over so he could have familiar noises.
That was the biggest frustration, talking to him and not knowing, is he hearing any of this? And him not being able to give me a smile and wink at me like, you know, he always does. So you're full of it, Dad. And you think it's like the movies, where all of a sudden he just wakes up, opens his eyes, and everything's fine. But as usual, that wasn't the case.
Hi, Dustin.
Hi, Dustin.
Hey.
I got to go visit him, and I think that was, I don't want to say better for me, but I got to see for myself. And I grabbed his hand, and he squeezed my hand.
We gotta go home, but we'll be back, okay?
Get better, Dustin. And then I remember he lifted up his hand and went like that. So I knew.
You think you are? That is good, good.
It took 3.5 weeks before Dustin was even able to communicate with hand signals.
We have no idea how it is to not be able to walk, to talk, to feed ourselves. His therapist would work with him, and he would just groan and moan because it hurt.
Mom told me that it'd all come back. It'd just be like being a kid again, little baby. I thought, whew, that's tough, but it's just another challenge. And I like challenges. I think it makes you better.
Throughout his recovery, Dustin's dream was to pitch again for his high school baseball team.
The very first game we played, I sat on the bench the whole time. I had never sat on the bench for baseball ever. That was tough, and I went home and I cried that night. And the very next night, Coach let me pitch.
You could tell, you know, his leg was stiff. He still was pinned up and stuff. So the first batter gets up, you know, and I don't remember how many pitches he threw, but he struck him out. Second batter come up, and again, you know, struck him out. Third batter come up, hit just a little pop fly. And all of a sudden, he just threw his hand up with a glove on it. The ball fell in it. I guess it was then I knew he was going to be all right.
Hey, I'm as cool as Kool-Aid.
Okay.
In the 14 months since the accident, Dustin and Stephanie have both made remarkable recoveries.
Stephanie and Dustin were close before, but they're a lot closer now. You couldn't talk about one of them bad and the other one not be ready to fight you.
We feel like we've been together through the tough stuff, so we might as well have some fun.
Neither Stephanie nor Dustin was wearing a seatbelt the night of the accident.
You don't want none of this.
If there's one thing that I could do different about that night besides not go, that'd probably be the key thing. Because if I wouldn't have been thrown in the car, then I probably wouldn't have been hurt as bad.
I still to this day cannot imagine that train hitting that little car. I think they should all have bars and lights at all crossings because they're bigger than you are.
Those kids are miracles.
I gotta go take a shower. Oh, God.